The room fell silent when the coffee hit the map. Not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic, but because every man in that naval intelligence room realized the same thing at the same time. The stains were in the wrong places, and those wrong places lined up perfectly with something that officially did not exist. 23 German U-boats. Hidden. Silent. And suddenly exposed by a mistake made by a 17-year-old who wasn't even supposed to be there. This wasn't luck. This was the kind of accident that gets people killed. He was 17 years old and invisible by design. Too young to enlist. Too young to question orders. Too unimportant to notice. That's why he was there. The British Admiralty building in early 1942 was not a place for prodigies or heroes. It was a place for tired men, stale air, and secrets buried under paperwork. Clerks moved maps. Analysts argued quietly. Officers stared at walls like they were waiting for them to blink first. And the boy, everyone called him the boy, did what he was told. Carry folders. Clean tables. Pour coffee. Nothing more. The Battle of the Atlantic was going badly. Ships were vanishing. Convoys torn apart in the dark. No distress calls. No survivors. Just empty ocean and unanswered questions. German U-boats were everywhere, and nowhere at once. Official maps showed patrol zones. Estimated positions, probabilities. None of them were right. The enemy was learning faster than the analysts. That morning, the boy was nervous. Not because of the war, he'd grown up with that, but because he had been assigned to the main chart room. The real one. The room officers didn't like civilians in. The room where voices dropped when doors closed. A massive Atlantic map covered the central table. Pinned, weighted, layered with transparent sheets marked in grease pencil. Dates, routes. Sinkings, red dots everywhere. Too many. He carried the coffee tray carefully, hands steady. Eyes down. Then someone shouted, not at him, across the room. An argument. A sharp command. Chairs scraped, papers shifted. The boy turned his head for half a second. That was enough. The tray tilted. A cup slid. Dark liquid spilled. Coffee soaked into the map. Time froze. An officer swore. Another lunged forward. Someone grabbed the boy by the arm and yanked him back hard enough to bruise. He expected punishment. What he got was silence, because the coffee wasn't spreading randomly. It was pooling, in lines, curves, clusters. The boy watched, terrified, as the liquid seeped into tiny imperfections in the paper. Creases left by repeated folding, pressure marks from long-removed pins, invisible guides pressed into the map by weeks of use. The stains formed shapes, routes, holding patterns. One officer leaned closer. Another went pale. A third whispered something no one was supposed to say out loud. Those are wolf packs. 23 distinct shapes emerged, not where the official intel said U-boats might be, but exactly where ships had disappeared, when overlaid mentally, perfectly, horrifyingly. The room erupted. Orders flew. Doors slammed. The boy was shoved against a wall and told not to move, not to speak, not to breathe if he could help it. He didn't understand what he'd done, only that it was very, very bad. Within minutes, senior officers arrived. Then, men in suits who didn't wear insignia. The map was photographed, traced, copied. The coffee-stained original was rolled up and removed like a body. No one looked at the boy, until one man finally did. "You didn't see this," he said quietly. "You didn't spill anything. And you weren't in this room." The boy nodded. He would have agreed to anything. That night, the Atlantic didn't know what was coming, because for the first time in months, the hunters had stopped guessing. And it all started with a mistake made by someone no one thought mattered. By evening, the boy no longer existed, at least not on paper. His name was removed from the duty roster. His signature vanished from the logbook. A clerk he'd never seen before escorted him through corridors he didn't recognize and sat him on a wooden chair outside a locked office. No windows, no clock, no explanation. Only the distant sound of telephones ringing far too often. Inside the Admiralty, the coffee-stained map had become something else entirely. Transparent overlays were placed on top of it. Convoy routes, weather reports, sonar contacts, radio intercepts. One by one, the lines aligned. Too cleanly. Sinkings that were once dismissed as coincidence now traced arcs across the Atlantic. Gaps in patrol zones suddenly made sense. The Germans weren't roaming randomly. They were waiting. Wolf packs weren't just attacking ships. They were predicting them. An officer slammed his fist into the table. "This means they're inside our routes," he said. "Not following, anticipating." Another man replied quietly. "Or someone showed them." No one liked that thought. The boy sat motionless outside the office while decisions were made that would never include his name. He replayed the spill again and again in his head. The tilt of the tray. The splash. The way the officers had gone pale. Not angry, not annoyed, but afraid. Not of him, of what the map revealed. Finally, the door opened. The man who stepped out didn't wear a uniform. He was older, gray-haired, eyes sharp in a way that felt surgical. "You like maps?" he asked. The boy swallowed. I carry them." The man nodded, as if that answered everything. "Come with me." They descended into a lower level of the building, past locked doors, past guards who checked badges twice, past a room filled with machines clicking and humming like insects trapped in metal. Radio intercepts. Enigma traffic. A war being fought in whispers. The man pointed to another Atlantic chart on the wall. "This is what we thought the Germans were doing," he said. Then he gestured to a fresh copy of the coffee-stained map, now carefully redrawn. "And this is what they're actually doing." The difference was terrifying. Convoys routed through safe corridors, sailed directly into ambush. Patrol aircraft swept empty ocean while U-boats waited just beyond detection range. The enemy wasn't faster or stronger. They were smarter. "Your spill showed pressure marks," the man continued. "Old pinholes. Reused overlays. Patterns no one noticed because they weren't looking for them." He turned to the boy. "You didn't discover anything on purpose," he said. "That's why it worked." That night, orders went out. Quietly, convoys were rerouted at the last possible moment. False signals transmitted. Old patrol zones abandoned without explanation. Submarines redirected to positions the Germans believed were empty. It was a gamble. A massive one. 3 days later, a German U-boat failed to return. Then another. Then 3 more. No distress calls. No transmissions. Just silence. The boy was told he would be reassigned. Not back to carrying coffee. Not home. Somewhere else. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere quieter. Where he would do the same thing he always had, observe without being seen. Because now they knew something dangerous. Sometimes, the most valuable weapon in war isn't a gun. It's a mistake. The first bodies surfaced a week later. Not German. British. Men pulled from the Atlantic with oil in their lungs and fingers frozen into claws. Survivors from convoys that had been rerouted too late, or rerouted based on old assumptions the enemy had already learned to exploit. The war didn't forgive discovery errors. It charged interest. The boy was moved to a coastal facility, whose name never appeared on official documents. A low concrete building near the sea, always damp, always humming. Here, maps weren't just paper, they were living things, constantly updated, erased, reborn. He wasn't told why he was there, but he understood. Every time he entered a room, conversation stopped. Officers watched his hands more than his face. Coffee was no longer allowed near charts. The mistake had become doctrine. They tested the theory, not once, over and over. Old maps were intentionally stressed, folded, pinned, layered, unlayered. Liquids introduced. Light angled low across the surface. Shadows revealed what eyes missed. Patterns emerged again, not just in U-boat placements, but in human behavior, where analysts reused the same pins, where pressure lingered from decisions long abandoned, where certainty had hardened into routine. The Germans were exploiting that routine. The boy began to speak more, not confidently, carefully. He pointed where stains curved instead of spread, where ink soaked deeper along invisible lines, where repeated handling had worn the paper thin. "You press harder here," he said once. "Because this part worries you." The room went quiet, because he was right. Intercepts confirmed it soon after. Encrypted German messages referenced zones of hesitation, areas where Allied convoys slowed slightly, just enough to reveal indecision, just enough for predators to adjust. The Atlantic wasn't just a battlefield, it was a psychological map. But something was wrong. The losses didn't stop, they slowed, but didn't end, because the Germans adapted again. Someone on their side had noticed the change. Someone very smart. A captured U-boat officer finally broke under interrogation. Not screaming, laughing. "You think you found us because of your brilliance?" he said. "We allowed you to think that." That sentence changed everything. The coffee spill hadn't revealed all positions. It had revealed the ones the Germans wanted found. Decoy wolf packs. Sacrificial units meant to mask something else, something deeper. That night, the boy couldn't sleep. The map room lights stayed on until dawn. Voices rose. Arguments sharpened. He stared at a fresh Atlantic chart and felt something cold settle in his stomach. The coffee had pooled where the paper was weakest. But what if the strongest parts never absorbed anything at all? What if the real positions were hidden, where the map looked untouched? He took a pencil, drew lightly, barely touching, lines that shouldn't matter. They did. The true pattern emerged slowly. Not clusters, not routes, but voids, empty spaces the Germans avoided entirely. Because that's where something important was moving. Something large. Something lethal. When the officers realized what the boy had uncovered this time, no one spoke. Because if he was right, the Allies weren't hunting U-boats. They were being herded. The empty spaces on the map were worse than the markings. Silence always is. Those voids, clean, untouched, almost polite, had been ignored for months because nothing ever happened there. No sinkings, no sightings, no radio whispers. Analysts had called them dead water. The boy called them protected water. Orders went out quietly. Convoys were diverted away from the suspected zones. Aircraft were sent to patrol the emptiness instead of the danger everyone could already see. Nothing happened the first day. Nothing the second. On the third night, a patrol aircraft never returned. No distress call. No debris. No flare. Just gone. By the end of the week, 3 more aircraft disappeared the same way. Then a destroyer escort vanished off the manifest without ever sending a signal. Not sunk in battle. Not attacked. Simply erased. That's when the word experimental started circulating in closed rooms. Intercepts from German Naval Command became strange, shorter, colder, almost confident. Phrases repeated. Transit corridor secured. Shadow asset operational. Enemy blindness confirmed. None of it made sense until a British signals officer noticed something terrifying. The messages weren't describing attacks. They were describing movement. The Germans weren't hiding submarines in the voids. They were moving something through them, something too valuable to risk detection, something that required silence. The boy was brought a new kind of map, not paper, acetate overlays, depth contours, ocean thermal layers, shipping noise profiles. He studied them without speaking for hours. Then he asked one question: why do these areas line up with deep thermal breaks? No one answered, because no one had thought to ask. The Atlantic wasn't flat. Sound didn't travel evenly. In certain depths, engines could vanish. Sonar could lie. Metal could pass beneath the sea like a ghost. The Germans had found a corridor beneath the war. Late that night, the boy placed his pencil down and whispered something that made the room go still. "It's not a convoy killer," he said. "It's a transport." The implications were unbearable. If the Germans were moving something massive, something experimental through the Atlantic undetected, then every assumption about naval dominance was wrong. This wasn't about U-boats anymore. This was about escalation. A single decoded fragment confirmed it. One word slipped through encryption before it collapsed again.
Träger.
Carrier, not a ship. A platform. Panic didn't spread. Fear did, because whatever the Germans were moving wasn't meant to fight yet. It was meant to arrive. The boy noticed one last thing before dawn. The corridor didn't end in Europe. It pointed west, toward North America. And for the first time since the coffee spill, the officers stopped watching his hands. They watched his face, because he looked like someone who had just realized the war was closer than anyone believed. They locked the room, not to keep anyone out, but to keep the truth from spreading. Because the moment the corridor pointed west, this stopped being a naval problem and became a homeland nightmare. The boy was ordered to redraw everything from memory. No copies, no carbon paper, no assistants. Just him, a pencil, and a map that could no longer be allowed to exist. His hands shook for the first time, not from fear, but from responsibility. As dawn broke, a senior naval officer finally said the thought no one wanted to voice. If this corridor reaches the coast, what's riding through it? No one answered, because the Germans didn't move empty corridors. They moved weapons. Fresh intelligence arrived from a source that almost never spoke. A defecting German radio operator captured in Iceland. He was pale, shaking, barely coherent. They promised him cigarettes, then safety, then forgiveness. He gave them 3 sentences. The boats don't hunt there. They escort, and whatever they escort never surfaces. The room went cold. A decision was made that broke doctrine. They would deliberately sacrifice a convoy, not to bait U-boats, to confirm the corridor. 47 ships were rerouted, quietly, without explanation, straight through the boys' marked emptiness. Every escort captain was told the same lie. Routine transit. They sailed into silence. For 6 hours, nothing happened. No sonar contacts, no periscopes, no radio chatter. Some officers began to hope the boy was wrong. That hope died at 2:17. One ship, an ammunition freighter, reported a sudden pressure wave. No explosion, no impact. Just a wall of displaced water that nearly rolled the vessel. Then the sea calmed, and something passed beneath them. Sonar operators stared at their screens in disbelief. The contact was enormous. Too large for a submarine, too quiet for a ship. Moving faster than anything submerged had a right to. Then it vanished. The Germans never fired. They didn't need to. The message was clear. You see nothing. You can do nothing. The boy was shown the sonar printout. He said nothing. Then he pointed to the map and marked a dot at the corridor's end. Not in the ocean. On land. Nova Scotia. If the Germans landed anything there, supplies, technology, personnel, the Atlantic defense line would collapse overnight. And worse, they'd never know it happened. The boy finally spoke. They didn't design this to fight navies, he said. They designed it to bypass them. A counter-operation was authorized under a name that would never be recorded. Not to attack the corridor, to collapse it. The boy was asked one final question. If you had to hide something like this, what would you fear? He didn't hesitate. Noise, he said. Chaos. Unpredictable movement. The plan was madness. They would flood the corridor with randomized sound, false convoys, decoy engines. Explosive depth charges detonated at irregular intervals, not to destroy but to distort. They would turn the ocean into static. If it worked, the corridor would become useless. If it failed, whatever was moving west would arrive. The first charges dropped at sunset. The sea screamed. And deep below, something changed course. The ocean didn't explode. It panicked. The depth charges weren't dropped in patterns. No grids, no logic, no rhythm. One charge detonated shallow. Another far too deep. Some didn't detonate at all. The Atlantic became a lie the Germans had never planned for. And somewhere beneath the screaming water, whatever had been moving west slowed down, then stopped. Sonar stations across 3 sectors began reporting the same impossible thing. Contacts overlapping themselves. Echoes returning before they were sent. Objects appearing, then erasing their own signatures. It was as if the ocean itself had forgotten what it was hiding. A German transmission broke through Allied static for exactly 4 seconds. Not encrypted, not coded. A raw panic burst. Corridor compromised. Navigation failure. Unable to. Then silence. The boy was pulled into a room with men who outranked entire fleets. They laid out German naval schematics recovered years earlier. Experimental propulsion drafts. Pressure hull concepts. Escort formations that made no sense, until now. One officer finally said it. They're not U-boats. They're transports. Transports for what? No one asked out loud. At 3:40, the sea answered. A British destroyer, HMS Ravager, lost sonar completely. Not jammed. Gone. Then, the ship listed hard to port. Crew were thrown from their bunks as something touched the hull. Not struck. Touched. Like a hand testing pressure. Men on deck reported a shape beneath the surface. Long, angular, unnatural. No periscope. No conning tower. Just a shadow too big to be a submarine and too deliberate to be a whale. Then it slid away. The Germans fired nothing. Still. That was when the boy realized the truth. This isn't the weapon, he said quietly. This is the delivery system. Intercepted German logs, decoded hours later, used a word Allied translators had never seen before.
Not Boot, not Flotte, Notträger. Trägerraum.
Carrier space. The corridor wasn't protecting the cargo. It was protecting the route. And the route was failing. The German response was immediate. They detonated their own charges inside the corridor. Controlled collapses. Sections of the ocean floor shifted. Pressure gradients reversed. Entire sonar blind zones vanished. The corridor didn't die. It bled. Then came the final movement. Multiple large contacts, 4, possibly 5, turned back east. But one didn't. One continued west. Damaged. Alone. Allied commanders argued for minutes that felt like hours. Sink it now? Track it? Reveal full capability? Then the boy pointed to the map. If it reaches shallow water, he said, you'll never touch it. A single task force was dispatched. No names, no flags, no radio chatter. They were given one order: do not let it reach land. At dawn, aircraft spotted the wake. Not foamy, not turbulent, flat, as if the ocean was being pressed down. The attack began. Depth charges. Aerial bombs. Torpedoes. Nothing hit. Everything passed around it. The shape absorbed sound, shock, even water movement, until one pilot ignored orders and fired anyway. He aimed not at the center, but ahead of the shadow. The explosion ruptured something. The ocean bulged, then rose. For the first time in the war, sailors saw it. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. A steel structure broke the surface for less than 2 seconds. Faceted, armored, covered in markings no intelligence officer could identify. Then it sank hard, uncontrolled. The sea swallowed it, and with it, whatever it carried. The boy collapsed into a chair. No one celebrated. No one spoke, because if one had slipped through, others might have before. That night, a single line was added to Allied records. Not about the boy, not about the corridor. Just a warning. Some victories are silent because the alternative was unspeakable. The silence afterward was worse than the explosions. No cheers, no confirmation, no wreckage floating to the surface. Just water closing like nothing had happened. By morning, command expected debris. Oil, metal, bodies. There were none. The Atlantic looked untouched, as if it had erased the event out of shame. Recon aircraft flew grid after grid. Nothing, not even a thermal scar. Whatever went down clean. Too clean. German naval transmissions changed that same day. The tone shifted. Shorter messages. No bravado. No ideology. Just logistics. Withdrawals. Cancellations. Emergency reroutes. Entire Atlantic patrol groups were recalled to European waters within hours. Something had gone wrong. Badly. The boy was ordered to stay silent. No debrief press. No commendation. No mention of his name. Instead, he was placed in a locked room with a single chalkboard and told to reconstruct how the coffee spill worked. He couldn't. Not completely. The stain followed depth lines, pressure curves, thermal gradients, things he didn't even know the names for. He had revealed something by accident, but understanding it was another matter entirely. That night, British intelligence intercepted a German message marked Personal High Priority. It was sent from a naval engineering division, not command. The content was short. Carrier space compromised. Prototype lost. Corridor collapse irreversible. Further attempts impossible under current conditions. Impossible. That word terrified Allied command more than any threat, because the Germans didn't write it lightly. Captured German sailors, taken days later in unrelated engagements, began saying strange things. Unprompted. That the ocean had been trained. That routes were prepared years in advance. That some missions were never meant to return. One sailor cried during interrogation. They told us, he said, shaking, if the water started whispering, we were already dead. The Allies didn't sleep that night, or the next, because if the corridor was real, then it meant the Germans hadn't been reacting to the Atlantic. They had been shaping it. Files were pulled from British archives dating back to 1936, hydrographic surveys with no civilian justification, seismic tests far from shipping lanes, naval construction orders marked non-combat that never reached shipyards. Something had been built without being built. A senior American officer finally voiced the unthinkable. What if the Atlantic was only the first test? The boy was moved again, this time underground. He was shown photos recovered from the engagement site. Enhanced, stitched, reconstructed. The structure that surfaced wasn't a submarine. No propeller. No conning tower. No torpedo tubes. It looked more like a shell. Hollow. Inside one blurred image, a marking was visible. Not German. Not Allied. A symbol used only in theoretical engineering drafts. It meant contained environment. They weren't moving weapons, the boy whispered. They were moving people. That was when intelligence made the connection no one wanted. The missing transports. The sudden halts and deportation convoys. Entire groups of prisoners disappearing from records without trace. They weren't lost. They weren't killed. They were relocated. The Atlantic corridor wasn't an attack route. It was an evacuation route. Evacuation from what? No one could yet prove. Late that night, another transmission was intercepted. This one wasn't naval. It came from a scientific facility in occupied territory, encrypted beyond standard military cipher. Only one line was cracked. Without the corridor, Phase Black cannot proceed. Phase Black. The war hadn't reached its peak. It had nearly missed something far worse. Phase Black wasn't listed anywhere. Not in captured orders. Not in decrypted Enigma traffic. Not even in documents marked post-war contingency. It existed only as a phrase whispered between departments that were never meant to speak to one another. The Allies formed a silent committee. No uniforms. No ranks. Just people who understood what secrecy really cost. They met underground in London, beneath rail tunnels still warm from the Blitz. The boy was there, quiet, pale, clutching a mug he no longer drank from. Maps covered the walls, not shipping lanes. Pressure maps. Thermal layers. Magnetic anomalies. Places where the ocean behaved incorrectly. The spilled coffee pattern fit 3 of them perfectly. A naval physicist finally spoke. If Phase Black depended on the corridor, he said slowly, then whatever they were moving could not survive surface transport. Or air, someone added. Or land, another whispered. The room went still. That left only one explanation. They were transporting something that couldn't be exposed. A captured German engineer broke 2 days later. Not under torture. Under exhaustion. He hadn't slept since being pulled from the sea. He asked for paper. He drew a shape, not a ship, not a bomb. A chamber. Layered walls. Shock insulation. Pressure balanced. And inside it, figures, standing, still. They told us it was for safety, he said. To preserve them. Preserve what? An interrogator asked. The engineer swallowed. People who could not be allowed to die. The phrase made no sense, until another document surfaced, a scientific memo from 1942, stamped, redacted. Biological limit exceeded. It described human subjects exposed to extreme stress conditions, not experiments, observations. The subjects didn't break. They adapted. The corridor wasn't meant to hide them. It was meant to protect the world from them. That night, Allied command ordered a full halt on all deep-sea operations along the anomaly zones. No sonar, no depth charges, no probes. If Phase Black was incomplete, they weren't going to finish it by accident. But the Germans were desperate now. Recon flights over Norway spotted emergency excavations near fjords, massive power draws, temporary facilities built straight into rock. If the Atlantic route was gone, they were building something else. The boy was brought another intercepted message. This one wasn't German. It was internal Allied traffic. A question from a junior analyst that had slipped past sensors. If Phase Black was evacuation, what was the destination? No one had answered, because everyone already feared the same thing. They weren't moving people away from the war. They were moving them toward its end. Aerial reconnaissance finally confirmed it. In a mountain range considered geologically dead, heat signatures appeared. Deep. Regular. Artificial. Something was active beneath kilometers of stone. The engineer, when shown the images, began to cry. That wasn't ready, he said. It was never meant to be finished. What happens if it is? Someone asked. He shook his head. You won't call it a weapon, he whispered. You'll call it a solution. The boy stared at the heat map, at the branching shapes beneath the mountain. They looked familiar. Too familiar. They copied the ocean, he said quietly. The corridor had been destroyed, but the idea survived, and ideas didn't need water to move. The mountain did not exist on any civilian map. No roads led to it. No villages surrounded it. Even shepherd paths curved away, as if the land itself refused to approach. German engineers called it Ort Epsilon. The Allies would never write the name down. What the boy recognized wasn't the shape of the tunnels. It was the logic, the branching, the redundancy, the way every passage curved instead of running straight, just like the corridor, just like the sea. They built an inland ocean, he said, a place where sound bent, where pressure equalized, where nothing could be tracked the same way twice, a place to hide movement. By now, German radio traffic had changed tone, not confident, not strategic, urgent, repeated requests for power allocation. Emergency transport orders canceled mid-transmission. References to containment delays. One message ended with a sentence that froze the room. Subject stability decreasing. No one asked what the subject was. They already knew it wasn't a machine. A special reconnaissance unit was assembled. Not commandos. Not saboteurs. Scientists. Engineers. One linguist who specialized in fractured German, technical language written by people who were afraid. They were inserted under cover of a routine bombing assessment. The mountain watched them arrive. Inside, the air was wrong. Too clean. Too regulated. Walls layered with materials not meant for strength, but silence. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. Not peaceful. Suppressed. They found chambers, not cells. Habitats. Minimal. Efficient. And empty. Then they reached the core, a circular vault with reinforced glass thicker than a ship's hull. Inside it, nothing. Just restraints. Fresh. An engineer touched the glass. It was warm. Alarms began to sound, not loud, but directional, guiding, hurting. The lights dimmed, then rebalanced, forcing movement in only one direction. Out. They never saw what triggered the evacuation. They only heard something shift inside the mountain, a sound like stone remembering how to breathe. The team escaped with seconds to spare. As they reached daylight, the mountain sealed behind them. No explosion, no collapse, just silence restored. Hours later, German command traffic went dead across the region. No surrender messages, no last stands, just absence. Back in London, the boy was asked to review the final data. Thermal readings dropped. Power consumption ceased. Whatever Phase Black was, it had ended itself. Or completed. The war continued. Cities burned. Armies fell, but no trace of the corridor returned. No inland oceans were ever completed. No preserved subjects were ever found again. The boy never drank coffee after that. He finished the war in a quiet office, recalculating shipping routes that no longer mattered. Years later, long after victory celebrations had faded, a classified memo crossed a desk marked "Declassify on failure." It contained one sentence: No evidence Phase Black was terminated, only that it was abandoned. The ocean still behaves strangely in certain places. Sound bends where it shouldn't. Currents shift without cause. And sometimes, ships report something passing beneath them. Not attacking, not hunting, just moving. As if looking for a corridor that no longer exists. The war ended on paper. Signatures. Photographs. Parades. But some files were never closed, only buried deeper. In the final weeks before Germany's collapse, Allied intelligence intercepted one last transmission routed through a dead relay station in Norway. It wasn't encrypted. It didn't need to be. Just coordinates. And a phrase written in hurried technical shorthand. Corridor logic preserved. Nothing else followed. No sender. No receiver. As if the message was never meant for a person. The mountain was revisited after the surrender, carefully. Quietly. The reconnaissance team found no guards. No bodies. No evidence of sabotage. The facilities were intact, powered down, clean, too clean. It looked less like an abandoned project and more like a room deliberately left empty for later use. Engineers dismantled what they could, but much of it made no sense. Materials without civilian applications, designs that solved problems no one admitted to having. One Allied physicist wrote a single line in his notebook before refusing to continue. This wasn't built to win a war. It was built to survive one. The boy, now a man, was offered medals. He refused them all. He accepted one thing instead, a request to erase his name from every document connected to the incident. Not redact, erase. Years later, long after the Atlantic returned to routine trade, sonar anomalies kept appearing. Brief. Inconsistent. Always dismissed. Always unexplained. One report described a mass moving beneath a convoy, too smooth for geology, too deliberate for nature. The report was archived, no follow-up ordered. The last known reference to Phase Black appeared decades later in a restricted NATO study. One sentence survived declassification. Phase Black demonstrates the danger of systems designed to outlive their creators. Nothing has surfaced. Nothing has attacked. Nothing has announced itself, which, according to the original German engineer, was exactly the point. Because the corridor was never just water. It was an idea, a way to move unseen, to persist, to wait. And ideas don't drown. This was Dark War Records. Some battles end. Some records never do.